Here we are. So we're going to run through 3.3. A reminder that we have our test this week over that material, which is 3.1, 3.2, and 3.3. What we talk about today is truth tables, which is kind of an interesting concept, but not very difficult. It should be no problem at all. So let's take a look at this. I guess we have a little bit of a warm-up with these skills from the last section. Let's take a look here. It says, let P equal the statement, the woman is pretty. Q is the statement, she earns $230,000 more on average in her lifetime. Okay, write in words the meaning of the following statement. So we've done this before, right? Okay, so negation P, conjunction Q, right? So if you are a little bit rusty, recall that we have negations, which are this symbol. We have conjunctions, which are this symbol and connect to the word and as well as the word but. We have disjunctions, which is your V, which is the word or, okay? And I guess we could say this. We even have conditionals. You're not going to really see this, but we're just doing that as review. And then we have our biconditionals. You're not going to see either of these really, but there's just your quick review. Okay, so negation, conjunction, disjunction, those are the main ones that you're going to see. Let's take a look at this. So which of the choices is correct?
C.
It is C. Let's take a look here. The woman is not pretty. That's negation P.
No, it's B. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Carry on.
Well, let's take a look. Maybe it's wrong.
Not negated though.
Oh yeah, that's true.
So it's A.
Wait, hold on a second, guys. Hold on. So negation P, that means the woman is not pretty. So it has to be C or D, right? You agree with me, right?
Yeah.
This is a conjunction, so we have to have the word
And.
okay, we're still looking good. Q, she earns $230,000 more on average in her lifetime. It is indeed D. Does that make sense, guys? Really good. Because it's not negation of Q. Good job. All right, let's move along. Okay, so let's take a look at this one. Let Q represent the following statement. The Q statement is 5 times 3 equals 30. So as this statement stands, is the Q statement true or false? So let's understand this because this leads directly into our truth tables. So 5 times 3 equals 30. I know you can't see that because my arrow's there. But as it stands, the Q statement is false. Everybody agree? All right. Now, if they want negation Q, what's the negation of this? It means that it becomes true. So the negation of that statement, the negation of Q means that it becomes true. Does that make sense, guys? Now, if the Q statement were false, if the Q statement were true, the negation of it would be false. So, because, one more time, and you kind of have to make sure you understand this here, because the Q statement is false to begin with, and they ask for the negation of Q, that means its negation must be true. Okay? Let's move along. Let's take a look at this one. Okay, determine the truth value for the statement P and Q. All right, so let's take a look here. So they want the truth value for the statement P and Q. Well, what do they mean by that? Well, let's understand. First and foremost, when they ask you for this, you first have to determine the truth value, whether it's true or false, of each of these statements. So 9 plus 4 is 13. Is that true or false?
True.
It's true. Okay, good. 7 times 5 is 35. Is that true?
True.
It is true. So P and Q, okay, when we have, and let's talk about this. Let's do this. We're going to call this truth. value. Okay? When we're dealing with a conjunction, both must be true to conclude true. When they're asking you for a conjunction, if both statements are true, then the conjunction is true. Does that make sense? Now, if one of these happened to be false, then it would be false. Does that make sense, guys? Okay, following me? So is this true or false? This is true. Okay, we'll talk about how it works with a disjunction in a moment. But when you're dealing with a conjunction, the word and, both have to be true. Since both of these statements are true, it's true. Does that make sense? The conjunction is true. All right, let's keep going. All right, let's take a look at this one. So for this problem, they ask you the negation of P, conjunction Q. Okay, let's take a look here. First and foremost, 2 plus 7 equals 9. Is that true? It is true. But if they ask you for the negation of that, what does that end up being? It ends up being false. Okay. 4 times 7. Is that true? No. This is false. Do they make any changes on that? No. So, let's take a look here. Both must be true to decide true when you're dealing with a conjunction. Well, is this going to be true or false?
True.
This is false.
Sorry.
That's okay.
But
So,
it's true that they're both false.
no, that's not what you're going for. But I understand what you're saying. What they're saying is that to decide whether it's true, they both have to be true.
Okay.
Like straight up true. Okay? But I do understand where you're going with that. But both of these in the circles have to be true for it to be true. Since we have 2 falses, it's false.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Okay? Now, in other words, the bottom line is when you're dealing with a conjunction, if you don't see 2 trues, you immediately jump false.
Okay.
Even if you see 1 true, it's still false. Does that make sense? It's not whether it's true that they're both false. That has nothing to do with it. Okay?
And if you have the or symbol,
We'll talk about that coming up. And so we'll see that in just a moment here. So let's take a look here. We'll talk about the disjunctions later. But here we go. Let's take a look at this one. 3 plus 3 equals 5. Is that true or false? It's false. Okay? Now, do they ask us to do anything with it? Negation, meaning that it becomes true. Okay? Are we so far on track to be true? Yeah, we are so far. Is 3 times 4 24? No, that's false. Do they ask us to do anything? They negate it, so it becomes. So therefore, since we have 2 truths, is it true? It is, because it's a conjunction. Does that make sense, guys? Okay? And that's how you start to do it. The thing is, you really have to get good at this. Otherwise, the truth tables are going to be tricky. All right, now we get to a disjunction. All right, so let's talk about the disjunction, how to handle that. All right, when you're dealing with truth values and you have a disjunction, at least one must be true to conclude true. In other words, disjunctions are more flexible. Disjunctions, you only need one of your statements to be true, to say true. However, if you don't even have that, it's false. Does that make sense, guys? Is that still recording by chance? Can you even see it?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So, let's go take a look at this. All right, P, is 5 plus 10 14? No, it's false. Do they ask us to do anything with it? No, so it stays false. You guys with me so far? Okay. 3 times 5, is that 15? Yes, it is. It's true. Do they ask us to do anything with it? No, so that one's as it is. Okay, so we have a false disjunction with a true. Is it true? Yes, it is true. It's true because it's a disjunction. Disjunctions allow us only one having to be true to get a true. So, what if this was changed to a conjunction, like we were doing? It'd be false. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. I know I'm going through this kind of slow, but I hope I'm getting everybody on the same path. Okay, so this is true because with disjunctions, you only need one of them to be true to conclude true. All right, let's take a look at this one. All right, 9 plus 7, is that 15? No, it is not. That's false. Do they ask us to do anything with it? No. 6 times 8, is that 96? No. Do they ask us to do anything with it? Sorry. Yes, so that's going to be true. They ask us to negate it, therefore the false becomes a true. Now, P is false. Negation Q is true because they have it as a disjunction. We can conclude what? It's true. Does that make sense, guys? All right. Hopefully getting the hang of it. Are there any questions at all? Okay, good. Let's keep going. All right, let's take a look at this one. It is okay to have a repetition of your element. Let's take a look. So 7 plus 8 equals 14. Is that true? No, it's false. Now, we don't have another statement. There's no big deal here when you have no other. What's P? It's false. Everybody agree? Mm-hmm. What's negation P? True. It would be true. Everybody with me so far? You guys see what's happening here? You don't always have to have a P, Q, R statement. You could potentially just have P. So if P is false, then that means the negation of P is true. And now it's a disjunction, meaning that our statement is true. Disjunction allows for one true at minimum to conclude true. Okay?
So if they were both false, does that mean
it would be
it's
false? Okay, so that's your minimum standard, right? So for example, let's come back to this. I like that question. With a conjunction, both have to be true, meaning that if you only have one true or you have no trues, it's immediately false, right? Okay. With a disjunction, at least one must be true to conclude true, meaning that if you have two trues, it's true. If you have one true, it's true. But if you have two falses, it's false. Does that make sense, guys? Okay, still going?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so let's take a look at this one. Okay. All right, so 7 plus 4 equals 11. Is that true?
No. Yeah. No.
7 plus 4?
It's true.
It's true, but the negation of it makes it false. Okay? 8 times 8, is that 64? It is. The negation of that, because that's what it calls for, is false. Well, what we have now is a false, disjunction, another false, meaning that our answer is false. Does that make sense, guys? Okay. Bottom line is anytime you see two falses, it's always false. Whether you're in a conjunction or a disjunction, if you see two falses, it has to be false. Okay, so this is indeed false. All right, we get to our first truth table. Here we go. No big deal. Let's take a look at this.
Burn it with fire.
Nah, we're not going to do that. Not after all the hard work we've done. Okay, so I'm not going to fill in the way it is over here. I'm going to show you guys how to do it using this. So, the way that you do truth tables is when you see two elements are being worked on, always it starts in the following way. So when we're dealing with truth tables, the way they start, okay? A truth table, I'm going to use P and Q, it doesn't matter. The way it starts is it's always true, 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 false, false, true, false, false. Let's understand. When we have a conversation between two people, P and Q, R and S, A and B, T and O, it doesn't matter. Both of us could be telling the truth. I could be telling the truth, you could not be. You could be telling the truth, I could not be. Or both of us could not be telling the truth. You with me so far? So think about this. Literally, this is all the ways that our conversation can go, right? We can both make true statements. One of us can make true statements, or a true statement, or both of us cannot be making true statements, right? So, when you're doing your truth tables, when they're two things. How do we know there's two things? SR. You don't see a T, you don't see a Q, you don't see another element in there. We will do a scenario later at the very end of class where there's a P, a Q, and an R, where three people are having a conversation, or there are three statements, three different statements, but we'll deal with that later, okay? So for now, we are dealing with a two-statement scenario with the truth table. Okay, like they already fill in, it always starts true, 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 false, false, true, false, false. Never change that order, or you will get your problem wrong. Okay, one more time. It always starts as your first one, true, true, second one, true, false, third, false, true, fourth, false, false. Never does it change. It always begins that way. I drive that home because it's so important. Okay, so what we have to do is decide all the ways that this conversation can go based on our problem. The problem is S, conjunction, negation, R. So for example, they would put S, conjunction, negation, R. And what you're going to do is list all the different ways that this conversation can go if the S and R are both true, if the R is true, the S is not, if the R is not, the S is true, and if both are false. That's what's going on here. You're deciding how all your options can go for the conversation for this, should that be. Well, what's this truth table? Well, your first step is, one, of course, to list all of your options, okay? You have to do that. But then, you have to figure out what's your next thing to do. How would I go to get to this actual answer? I'm going to need to know what negation R is. I need to know what negation R is before I pair it with the S's. Well, what's negation R? Come to the R column, and what's the opposite of true? False. What's the opposite of true? False. Opposite of false? True. Opposite of false? True. Now, if this is not totally making sense to you right now, it's okay. It's a little bit odd. The more you get a hang of it, the better. Or the more practice you get, the more you'll get a hang of it. Okay? Now, we've just figured out what negation R is. From here, we can pair the negation R with the S using the rules of conjunction to figure out the actual answer. One more time. Since we now know negation R, we can then connect it with S using the rules for conjunction to make a decision about each of these items. Let's take a look. S, conjunction, negation R. What's the rule for conjunction? Both have to be true to be true.
False.
This is going to be false, exactly. S is true, negation R is false. They both have to be true to be true, but they're not. Okay, let's move on to the next one. What is that going to be? False, false is going to be false. Okay, let's move on to the next one. True, true is going to be true. False, true is going to be false. And this right here is your answer. Now, in the completing it, they want you to go each individual thing, but I just did that for you. You can type that in yourself. Does that make sense? Okay, so there it is. I'm going to skip this one. We have plenty more to practice on. Okay. All right, let's take a look at this one. All right, so here's the problem. The problem is P or negation Q. P disjunction negation Q. Your first four items, true, 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 false, false, true, false, false. Isn't that the same thing? Okay, every time. All right, in order to solve this one, you have to know what negation Q is first. What's negation Q? You have to figure out all the opposites to these. Well, the opposite of true is? Opposite of false is? Opposite of true is? Opposite of false is? True. So what we've just done is we've figured out all the opposites of the Q so that we can actually answer the bigger thing, which is P disjunction negation Q. Make sense? Okay. Now, which columns do we need, A, B, or C, to answer our actual question? A and C. Does that make sense, guys? We need A and C to answer this column. Why? Because this column calls for a P, it calls for the negation of Q, and it calls for the rules for disjunction. Does that make sense, guys? So, bottom line is, you need those to answer this final piece, to actually answer the question. So here we go. P is true. Negation Q is false. The rule is disjunction, therefore the answer is?
True.
Good job, true. You don't need both to be true because it's disjunction. Disjunction, you only need one to be true, okay? Next one, true and true. True. Next one, false and false. Next one, false and true. And that's your answer right there. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions about that at all? All right. I'm not going to type it in because they want them individually. All right, let's take a look at this next one. This next one has a few more parts than normal. Okay? So, your first step, because you see a P and a Q, true, 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 false, false, true, false, false. And if, just in case you can't see it, that's a negation, P or disjunction, negation Q. And those are in parentheses. As you can see, this is a three-part problem. Why? Because you first needed to know what's negation Q. You then need to know what them together would be, and then you need to know the negation of that. Take a moment and ask questions about how that was planned. In order to answer this, you need to disassemble all the pieces so that you can put it together. You first need to know PQ, then you need to know the negation of Q, then you need to know negation of Q with P, using the disjunction rules, and then the whole piece together. And that's how you do all these problems. Okay, so let's go do the negation of Q. What's that going to be? False. True. False. True. How do we figure that out? Well, negation of Q means all the opposite of whatever's in the Q column. Opposite of true, false. False, true. True, false. False, true. Done. Okay. Now, we need to do P disjunction negation Q. Which columns do we need? P column, negation Q column. And we're using which rules? Disjunction, which is the opposite. Not opposite, negation. The rules say at least one have to be true to be true. Sorry, guys. Okay, so here we go. True, false. Good. True, true. True. False, false. And false, true. True. Okay, we're done with that one. Now, we got to answer the actual question, which is this. Which columns or column do we need to answer this one? Just this one, right? Because this answer here only needs what? The opposite of these. Does that make sense, guys? So, what's the opposite of true? True. False. False. True. And this is your answer right here, officially. that make sense? Okay, any questions about that? Is it still going?
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. All right, let's keep on rolling. Okay, so now they say construct your own truth table for this. You know, the nice thing is that they actually give you all the column headers. What you should now start to be able to do is if I mark these away, you would be able to figure out what your column headers would be yourself. Does that make sense? That's ideal, is the ability to make your own column headers because you know the steps needed to go and solve this. Okay, so really important that you get to that. This problem is P, disjunction Q, conjunction, negation of Q. All right, well, again, they already gave it to you, right? So all you need to do is be able to figure it all out based on your column headers. So let's do the pieces individually. What comes first, everybody? Yes, your whole PQ column right here. Everybody agree? So you have to have true, true, then what? True, false. Then what? False, true. Then what? False, false. That is the first step. You have to be able to do that every time. Okay? And then the last one right here. Okay, good. Now, let's take a look here. They obviously tell you what you have to do. But let's understand why. Let's understand the logic. They said negation of Q is the thing that comes next. Why? Well, you have to know what negation Q is to be able to answer the whole thing, don't you? If you don't ever figure out what negation Q is, it'll never come out. So, what's the negation of Q? Top to bottom. Go for it. False. True. False. True. Good. So that one's done. Let's understand their next line of logic. Why do we need P or Q? P disjunction Q. Why do we need that? Because that's the other side of it, isn't it? If you know this one, you know the other half of that. So as you can see, we're figuring out both halves, and then we'll put it together in the last step. Does that make sense, guys? Okay, so in order to do P or Q, we need to know what P is, we need to know what Q is. We don't need negation Q yet. That's going to come at the end. All right, so rules for disjunction, at least one should be true. True, true, what's that? Good. True, false. True. False, true. False, false. Okay, good. Now, which columns do we need to answer the final question?
The middle two.
The middle two, these guys right here. Does that make sense? To actually finish out the entire problem, we're going to need negation Q. We're going to need P or Q. These two columns are critical to answering the actual final column. And what rule are we going to use? Rule for conjunction or rule for disjunction? Conjunction. Both have to be true to be true. Here we go. False, true. False. True, true. False, true. True, false. And there you go. That's your actual answer. Does that make sense? Bottom line is that if you get these right, all of them, it means you totally understand it. Okay? So let's keep going. Very nice. Good work. All right, let's take a look at this one. I'm going to go and mark out what is needed here. Hopefully, guys, I mean, you could go and cheat or whatever, but see if you can figure out what's needed yourself. Okay? Obviously, I'll just leave this up. We're used to that.
What's the?
Yeah, what's the?
Oh, yeah. Oh, that worked out great. There you go. Perfect. So, I mean, the obvious hint is that you have 3 additional columns, right? That's already built there for you. It's not always going to be 3. So, what's one of the things we for sure need?
We just need, the only thing we need is negation, negative.
We need negation Q for sure. Then what would be the next step after that?
P
Conjunction negation Q.
P conjunction negation Q. So we would need this. That's why we have extra work there. Then we would need this. That would help us get that. And then we would need to do what with the two? Combine them to actually get the answer. Does that make sense, guys? Okay? So you want to be able to do this. You don't want to rely on them to give you this because the later questions at the very end, you have to do that yourself. Okay? So as you can see, I'm trying to walk you through. We started off with very basic. Now we're going to more complex. All right, let's start rolling through these a little faster. What's negation Q? False. True. False. True. Good. Done with that one. How about P and negation Q? P and negation Q. What's the first one?
False.
False. Because. Oops, that wasn't very good. P, negation Q, true, false, false. How about the next one? True. Good. Both true. Next one. False. Next one. False. Does that make sense, guys? Please ask questions. All right, last column. What rule are we using? Disjunction. And we're going to combine these two columns, right? These two. All right, first one is what? False. Next one. True. Next one. False. Last one. True. And there it is. Done. Still going?
Yep.
Perfect. Thank you. Makes sense, guys? Starting to get a little bit better. First time you saw it, you're like, what is this stuff? Now, it's starting to make more sense, hopefully. Okay. Well, I'm not going to go mark them out, but I hope you guys are starting to see where this is going. You do want to be in the habit of knowing how to set up your column headers, because very end, they're going to have you do it yourself. This is a long one, isn't it? Let's understand where each one comes from, right? So, you obviously have your standard, right, PQs, don't you? You have your standard PQs that you have to get. So, true, 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 false, false, true, false, false. Everybody agree? Okay. Now, that's kind of a given. But where do they get each of these? Let's understand the logic. Well, if you look at the original problem, go look at it. They get the negation P because you have to have that to answer the problem. They get the negation Q because you have to have that to answer a part of the problem. Does that make sense, guys? That's where they come up with those. So let's go just do those real quick, shall we? All right, so we're going to go do those real quick. All right, here we go. Negation P, what's that? False. False. True. True. Very good. Negation Q is what? False. True. False. True. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. Now, where do they get this one from? Q disjunction P. Well, that comes from right here, doesn't it? You have to know what Q disjunction P is to answer that one. Now, the obvious question is, wait a second, Andrew. If you just did this, why didn't they just do this one next? They could have. It doesn't matter. You could have done these in different orders and still got the same answer, right? But they just happen to want to do this one for whatever reason, fine. So they just are wanting you to take care of that part, but then you can see that they then take your two negations and put them together to finish that part of it. Does that make sense? Okay, so here we go. Let's go answer Q disjunction P, shall we? All right, so Q disjunction P, Q or P, that's these, isn't it? What is that? True, because the rule for or is that one must be true. How about the next one? True. Next one. True. Last one. False. Perfect. Q or P is what they're calling for. True, 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 false. Because the rules for or, so you have to have at least one true. All right, now they go and have you do the disjunction of your two negations, which is this part. Does that make sense, guys? Okay, so let's take a look. We need these two columns using the rules for or. Rules for or say at least one true. So what's the first one? False. Next one. True. Next one. Last one. True. Does that make sense, guys? Okay. Now you can see where this comes in because they take this one on the left, this one on the right, and use the rule for conjunction to do it. Does that make sense? So here we go to actually close out the problem. We need these two columns to actually finish it. Does that make sense, guys? Here we go. Two trues or at least one true to answer this, to get true. Both have to be true. True, false.
False.
True, true. True, true.
True.
False, true. And that's the correct answer. Does that make sense, guys? Still going?
Yep.
All right, fantastic. I hope you guys really starting to get the hang of this now. All right, I'm going to skip this next one, all right, because I think you guys can do it on your own. Let's keep going. Now, let's talk about this one. For the first time, we see three of them. Now, remember a moment ago, I told you that we would see that, and here's how it goes. When you see three letters in your problem, P's, Q's, and R's, three letters in your problem will start a little bit differently. Instead of having 4, you're going to have 8. Instead of having 4 rows, you'll have 8 rows. Okay? As we talked about a moment ago, the PQ problems, like we've just been doing the last 20 minutes, always start as true, 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 false, false, true, false, false. You might have been a little overwhelmed to try to remember them, but now you get it. This one is just as easy if you know the pattern, okay? So the P column with a 3-letter problem is always 4 truths and 4 falses. It always starts that way. This is one of, if you find it, there's several ways to remember it, but to me, this is one of the easier ways. Your P column is 4 truths and 4 falses. You with me so far? Your Q column, 2 true, 2 false. 2 true, true, 2 false. Like that every time. You with me so far? So your P column, 4 and 4. Q column, 2, 2, 2, 2. And you can guess your R column is going to be true, false, true, false, true, false, true, false, right down the line. Now you'll never have to remember, okay, the first one is true, 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 false, true, false, true. You don't have to remember it that way. It's always 4 and 4, 2, 2, 2, 2, 1, 1, 1, 1. 4, 2, 1. Does that make sense, guys? Okay. This is the way every PQR type problem will start. Just like this is the way every PQ problem will start. Okay? And that's how your columns go. All right. So with that said, let's take a look at this problem. The bad thing is that I don't have much space here, so let me kind of zoom out just a bit so that I can fit everything in. All right? Okay, this is a little bit better, but a little harder to see, but let's do this. So, our first row, there it is. Let's go take care of it. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, perfect, 8. There it is. All right, true, 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 true. Like I said, it starts like this every time, right, everybody? Okay? And then false, 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 false. Okay, your Q, true, true, false, false. True, true, false, false. Thank you. Your R, true, false, true, false, true, false, true, false. Does that make sense, guys? Is it that tough? No, not really. Not really at all. Maybe this helps you see them a little bit better. All right. Okay. All right. Now, let's understand the thought process here. This problem is P, disjunction, negation Q, disjunction, negation R. Does that make sense, guys? So, we're going to need a negation Q. We're going to need a negation R. Then we'll put those together and then close out the problem. So you can see the planning that they did and you should be able to do to get to your answer. Okay, so let's go do negation Q, which is what? False. False. True. True. False. False. True. True. Does that make sense, guys? Any questions about that at all? My columns stink. It's okay. I'll straighten it out later. I don't know. We'll see. All right, that one looks a little better. All right, we have to do negation R too as well. Negation R is what? False, true, false, true, false, true, false, true. You got it. Good job. And there's that. Okay. Now, we got the negation Q. We got the negation R. Can you see why this is the next thing to come up? Because you put together P or negation Q. That's where this column comes from. Okay? All right, so here we go. You need which column? The P column as well as the negation Q column. You got to look at this really carefully. Helps to maybe put your fingers on it. Okay, the rules are OR, right? The rules are OR. P column, negation Q column, true, false. True. True, false. True, true. True, true. False, false. Oh, crap. False, false. False, true. And finally, false, true. True. And you guys on paper, so it's a lot nicer than me on the board. Okay, next. The last thing is we have this. We have the negation R, and we're going to connect the two. So we need which columns? Negation, the P or negation Q, as well as what?
Negation R.
Negation R. These are the two columns needed to close out the problem using which rule? OR rule. Okay, here we go. False, true. True, true. False, true. True, true. False, false. True, false. True. False, true. And finally, true, true. That's it. Done. And that's your answer all the way through. Does that make sense, guys? Is that still going? Please tell me it's going.
Yeah.
All right, awesome. Okay, let's keep going. Almost there. Where are we at on time?
30 seconds.
30 seconds.
Okay, perfect. All right, so take a look at this one. It says determine the truth value for this statement. Okay, let me blow it up a bit. Okay, determine the truth value for this statement. Now, what you have to do here is you have to go and go create a truth table, a little mini table for each of the pieces. Does that make sense? So, what does this mean? Okay, so P is true. That's what they just said. Does that make sense, guys?
Yep.
Or, here, these two. Q is true, and R is true. Does that make sense, guys? So they basically just did a segment of your truth table. Well, let's go look at this. What is in parentheses goes first? True and true. What does that end up being?
True.
True. True or true. What does that end up being?
True.
True. That's how you do a problem like that. Super, super easy. In fact, it's super easy because you don't have to do a whole truth table. Let's keep going. Same concept. I'm going to skip forward. Same concept. Going to skip forward. This is a little bit of a word problem. I think you guys will be fine. Same thing, okay? So I think you guys are going to be in good shape. If you are unsure about that, help me solve this. We'll help you go through it. Remember, we have a test on Wednesday for you guys, internet class this week. All right, that's it. Hold on, sorry.